Hello and welcome to the International Transport Forum's Ask the Author.
Everybody in. So good afternoon again.
Excuse me. On managing competing sectoral demands for energy resources, transitioning to sustainable transport. My name is Ronan Mackerlane from the ITF Communications team, and I'm delighted to be joined by Matteo Creglia and Andreas Kopf, two of the co-authors of this report. This report was featured in the COP29 climate change negotiations, creating huge interest across the sectors because it's looking at how not only transport, but all sectors of the economy are competing for energy resources in the future and how to address those challenges. So if this is your first time at an Ask the Author, a quick reminder that we'll have a rapid presentation of the issue, the methodology, and the main findings of the report. I'll give you a link to the full report for your in-depth read during or after the session. And then the floor is open to you to use the Q&A, the question and answer function, so we can moderate as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, I'll pass over to our lead authors, Matteo and Andreas, for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rowan, for this kind introduction. Welcome everybody to this Ask the Author session on our recent report on managing competing sectoral demand for renewable energy sources, which we have co-authored also with UC Davis Institute of Transport Studies. And so the ITF is integrated within the OECD, and we work on all transport-related topics. But recently, we have extended our work also to the energy sector, also including other sectors of the economy, since, how Ronan rightly mentioned, it's not only the transport sector that seeks to decarbonize, but they all seek to decarbonize, and they do try to do that at the same time. And so if these sectors decarbonize at the same time, they all need the same 4 key energy resources. And so that includes renewable electricity, low carbon hydrogen, then sustainably sourced bioenergy and their respective fuels, and then also, fourthly, synthetic fuels and carbon capture technology behind, which is needed to produce synthetic fuels. And so these resources, these resources, the supply is at very, very low levels today, and they need to be scaled up at unprecedented speed to meet climate targets. And if we meet these climate targets during the period of scale up of these resources, these will be scarce. And so then the question is, how should governments ideally allocate or prioritize these resources to maximize emission savings? And because some energy resources, they can be used in multiple sectors, but they have a greater benefit if they are used in one sector rather than in another sector. And so this is an example here, a simple example of sustainable bioenergy, here shown as a biofuel. And this could be used to decarbonize high temperature heat in industry applications, or also in residential heating to replace natural gas, or it could also be used in road transport, either as a fuel, or it could be used to produce electricity and then to propulse an a battery electric or an electric vehicle. And so so the key point is that these resources are and will be scarce, and so they need to be ideally prioritized using a cross-sectoral merit order to maximize the emission savings. And so what do we mean by these resources being scarce? And so starting again with using the example of bioenergy. And so the global potential for sustainable bioenergy is limited. And so what we can see here is the energy demand from all transport modes by 2050. And assuming that they all use bioenergy-based fuels. And if we would then now compare that to the sustainable biofuel, we can see that the availability of biofuel and biogas will be not sufficient to decarbonize the entire transport sector by itself, only using sustainable biofuels. And so we see, for example, for liquid biofuel, that this will not even be, let's say, enough sufficient to decarbonize half of the aviation sector by 2050. And so while some of biogas is currently used and could be used in transport, there are other hard-to-abate applications that could use biogas. And this is, for example, process heat in like high temperature heat above 500, above 1000, above 1500 degrees Celsius. And so what we can see now in the top row is the energy need that we had 2023 through high temperature heat above 1000 degrees Celsius by different sectors. And so again, here we see that biogas, sustainable biogas in 2050 will be insufficient to satisfy this demand only for high temperature heat. Key point here is that sustainable bioenergy, both for biogas, biofuel, is highly likely to be limited in the long term, 2050, and will be needed for sectors with few or with no alternatives to decarbonize, which is, for example, aviation or industrial high temperature heat applications. And so if we extend that a little bit to a second resource, which is low carbon hydrogen, this follows the same idea. So we see in now the energy demand in 2030 of the hypothetical energy demand or demand for hydrogen in 2030 throughout different transport modes. And so if we compare that with the supply of fossil fuel, we can see that this will be insufficient to decarbonize any of these sectors. And if we compare that again with today's supply of low carbon, so green hydrogen, we can see that the supply of green hydrogen is negligible compared to the supply of fossil hydrogen, and even more so for the potential hypothetical demand. And so we can see, and at the very left, we can see the final investment decisions, FID. So these are all, so we see in the top row are the projects by project phase, and only a tiny little share is either already operational or has obtained final investment decision. And the vast majority of all of these projects, they are either in feasibility or in concept stage. And even if all projects that are in feasibility and concept stage, they would be realized by 2030. Even then, this would only be sufficient to replace 50% of the fossil supply of hydrogen. And so, but to get an idea, usually the rate of projects that obtain FID is around 5%. So historically, we could own using historic data on FID, we can only account for like 5% of these concept projects, which will then end up in supply. Key point is that the supply of low carbon hydrogen is going to be very scarce, and therefore the use of it should be prioritized. And so we've seen that energy resources, they are scarce, and so we need to handle them as efficiently as possible. And so that means that if there are multiple possible energy pathways, using different energy technologies, we should choose, take into account the global efficiencies and use the most efficient solutions. And so here we can see 3 different pathways in transport using, let's say, the same amount of the bottom three rows, using the same amount of electric input, which is here 100 kilowatt hour. And so we can see if we would use battery electric powertrain using like direct electrification, this would have a significant longer range of this car than going through alternative pathways such as hydrogen, because this involves converting low carbon electricity in an electrolyzer to hydrogen, then storage and distribution losses, then including a fuel cell, and then the efficiency then of the electric propulsion, of the electric engine. And so this is an example for 3 different technologies, how they should be prioritized, taking into account the global efficiencies of these different pathways. But this is only one method to prioritize technologies by the most efficient use, but there are many, many other factors to consider as well, which should go into this prioritization. And now I'm handing over to my colleague, Matteo.
So one of the challenges with prioritizing these scarce resources is that markets on their own often don't allocate them optimally. So that we think that governments have a role to play in designing additional regulations, such as carbon pricing, such as blending mandates and performance targets, to nudge the markets to better allocate resources. And this can be helped by developing what we call a global merit order. And some of the factors that should be included in this prioritization includes energy efficiencies of different technologies, as Andreas mentioned firstly. Secondly, their costs. How expensive are they relative to each other, and how much carbon do they save for a certain amount of additional expense, something that we typically call marginal abatement costs. How available are some of these resources? As we mentioned, biofuels are limited in their availability. Hydrogen will take a very long time to scale up. All of these can be used to sort of define what a global optimal use of resources would be in different sectors. There are then likely to be some regional differences within that, which mean that it's likely to be challenging to get a complete global optimum. For example, the natural endowment of resources varies in different regions. There are some regions which have a very large amount of biofuels, and they might want to use biofuels in perhaps a suboptimal way, in a way that that resource might be actually better used in another sector. There are also then, challenges with adopting some technologies. Some regions have capital constraints and can't always adopt even something if it is a more efficient and more cost-effective technology, if it is more capital intensive. And then finally, regions also then have other considerations to do with energy and trade security, which again may affect their use of resources in something that may end up being suboptimal from a global perspective. A final point to consider when trying to prioritize resources is fairness and inequity. So, for example, using biofuel, the limited biofuel resources, prioritizing it towards the aviation sector, kind of has some socially skewed benefits, given that the people globally who travel the most with aviation tend to be the richest 5% of the global population, as this figure on the right shows. So the richest 5% do 55% of global aviation. So if we were to reserve this limited resource purely for this group of people, that you can be argued is not necessarily fair, rather than emerging economies using biofuels in other sectors. Something to consider. However, I guess we tried to consider all of these types of factors and came up with a first, draft of what we think a global optimal merit order for different uses of these 4 resources would be. And this type of merit order can be used to help inform long-term prioritization of resources, see which technologies are best in which sectors, and then based on this, policies can then be defined to shape the use of resources. So very quickly, on the right is sort of the current marginal abatement costs, and in the left is how they might change in future. If we look at trucks, for example, currently biodiesels and biomethane are relatively cost competitive compared to battery electric trucks, for example. But in the near future, we expect electric trucks to be more cost competitive, have more emission savings than these alternatives, and therefore we think that they should be prioritized where possible. Electrification should be prioritized where possible. You can see then things like hydrogen fuel cells are far, far more expensive way to decarbonize and are less of a priority. Secondly, if we look at biomethane, using biomethane to replace natural gas within the grid is likely a better use of that limited resource than using it in trucks, which is a more expensive way to decarbonize. The same for biodiesels. In this case, some of those resources are likely to be needed for the aviation sector, since any alternatives to the aviation HEFA are even more expensive. And finally, for ethanol in cars, as we mentioned before, if you want to decarbonize all of aviation, you're likely to need to use some of those resources in the aviation sector, and electrification is likely to be a cheaper alternative. And finally, then hydrogen is best used for replacing existing uses of fossil hydrogen rather than using it within the road sector, which is a far more expensive and less energy efficient use of that energy. So just finally then, our recommendations, we suggest to prioritize the scarce use of resources using a merit order to maximize these emission savings. We think that of those, biofuels and e-fuels should be prioritized where possible for sectors with limited alternatives for decarbonization, particularly things like heavy industry or aviation sector, given that electrification is likely to be a cheaper alternative. We think that electrification, where possible, should be prioritized, both within the transport sector, but also, for example, within buildings and industry, since it's likely to be more energy efficient and cheaper than alternatives. And finally, we recommend to avoid mandating the use of hydrogen in road transport, again, since electrification is likely to be a cheaper alternative, and that hydrogen is better used in more resilient sources of demand to displace existing uses of fossil hydrogen. We're happy to answer any questions you may have, and we'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Matteo and Andreas, for a very comprehensive and succinct overview of the report. Again, the link to the full report is in the chat. And now it's over to our participants. It's your chance to ask everything you need to know using the Q&A, the question and answer function that will allow us to moderate as many questions as possible. So to get us kicked off, there's a very simple question on from the road transport sector. Would you consider e-fuels as being suitable for road transport applications?
So this is a good question. We saw that renewable electricity is needing to be scaled up and being used throughout the economy, and therefore it's relatively scarce, and we're going to need to use it for as most energy efficiently as possible. We also saw that e-fuels are a very inefficient use of that renewable electricity, and that the costs of using e-fuels in road transport are likely to be far more expensive as a way of decarbonizing these sectors than using electricity or potentially even biofuels as a complementary technology to sectors that can't be electrified. So we don't think that e-fuels are a good use for decarbonization in the road transport sector, both in cars and in trucks.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. A reminder to you to use the Q&A, the question and answer function for your questions to our experts, please. Thank you very much for the information on the merit order and for that proposed taxonomy. Question on the biofuel use in road transport again. Why is that in yellow? Why is that on the second category? And also, is that also linked to the fairness and equity lens?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very good question. And so if we would like to decarbonize the entire, not only on the entire transport, but the entire economy, that means that we need to use these resources as best, as efficiently as possible, also given that they are limited. And so it is like, let's say, a suboptimal solution because there are cheaper alternatives in the long term available, which is most likely direct electrification, which is already happening in many, many regions of the world. However, there is then this question of equity, as you have again mentioned, since some regions of the world, they have access to these resources, and so they can use it very cheaply to increase their mobility in their countries. And so arguably, then there is a debate to be made if they should ship these resources to be decarbonizing rich people in other parts of the world, or if they should use it themselves. But on a global level, this would indeed be a suboptimal use, given that A, the resource is limited, and B, there is a cheaper opportunity.
Thanks very much, Andreas. There's a question that I guess is a follow-up to this, which is about prioritization and how might a resource prioritization vary across jurisdictions and regions. Can you speak to that question, Andreas?
So as we mentioned, there are some regions that have a large endowment of renewable energy, and they may want to use them. I mean, we can take bioenergy again as the example. There are some countries such as the United States or Brazil, countries in Southeast Asia that have very large resources of bioenergy, and where bioenergy can in some cases be cost competitive with other alternatives in the road transport sector. I think some of the challenge though is if you wanted to decarbonize the global aviation sector, you will need some of those resources, those bioenergy resources as a source of sustainable carbon to do so. So here we have a bit of a conflict between what is sort of a globally optimal way of allocating these limited resources, and then more local, I guess, calculations about how to use them. And I think to resolve this, it's important, long-term optimally, if resource-rich countries export their resources, such as biofuels or hydrogen, low-carbon electricity, that they are then well compensated by resource-poor economies to ensure that at least the benefits of these resources go back to the local populations.
And also just to reiterate that, this is also a huge economic opportunity in the long term, because we know that we will need these resources, not only to decarbonize the transport sector, but there are many other applications where this is a very good primary or a complementary solution. And so this is something that also, flip it other way around, this can be a huge economic opportunity. And so countries, particularly with like huge national endowments of these resources, this is something that they probably should include in their long-term economic and energy system planning.
Thanks both for those very good answers. A reminder to, we have still a few minutes to take as many questions as we can. So use the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window to send us your question. A question on advanced biofuels and scaling them up. You mentioned that they need to be scaled up. By what order of magnitude does that need to happen, and how can that happen?
Very good question. So basically, where are we starting from today? Is that we have a very little share of advanced biofuels actually in use. And so there is only 6% of all biomass that is currently used today is liquid biofuels. And out of this 6%, only around 10% is of advanced biofeedstock, which means approximately is like half an exajoule. So this is where we are starting off today. And so what we have seen in this previous slide is where we need to go, which is, let's say, the global limit of sustainable, which is between 20 and 30 exajoules. So we need to multiply that by, we need to scale this up by like multiple orders of magnitude. So this is just to know where we are starting from. So then as a subsequent question then is, how can you influence, or how could you influence policies in ramping this up earlier? So I guess today there are mandates for biofuel use in road transport, which have been very successful in the past because they are mandates. But we consider that this is in the long term not necessary anymore, because there will be other cheaper and more sustainable solutions such as direct electrification, which means that governments, they should start shifting away from mandates in road transport and start to like shift these mandates towards other sectors. So for example, aviation. And but that also includes that these refining capacity, or these refineries that are currently producing biofuels, so that's one thing. The second thing is that the current use of these refineries is not necessarily advanced feedstock, which means that they use still food crops that could be used then to produce food, which means that in the long term, these refining capacities, they would need to be transferred to use advanced biofeedstocks, such as also municipality waste or bagasse or just agricultural residues, which is going to be challenging because this is not currently commercially available. So this is also where we suggest that this shift of mandate should start quickly, and then also to ramp up these processes, these refining processes using advanced feedstocks.
Thanks very much indeed. There's time for a few more questions. Pop your questions into the Q&A. We'll take a next question from Sri Priya Ranganjaru, who thanks us for the presentation. You said that the allocation of different industries is based on individual countries' policies and availability of resources. Question is, how do you then influence the policies? A very broad question.
It's a very good question. It's the $1 million question, probably. But so we think that already having a merit order can help to understand, for example, as was mentioned before, where do you need blending mandates and where shouldn't you have blending mandates? Where should you try and use resources more rather than other sectors, as a sort of a good first principle. There's also then policies such as things like carbon pricing, particularly in the aviation and shipping sectors, which are currently underpriced in terms of their damages to the environment. These are hugely necessary, and already putting in these types of policies would help to realign where some of these resources go. For example, at the moment, the purchasing power of aviation or shipping in particular for low carbon energy resources such as bioenergy is not very high. Whereas if you had some of these policies in place, there would be more of a demand, which would again start to shift some of these resources towards these sectors. But then in a globally competitive environment, it's also important to try and move some of these resources to different uses, potentially also through things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, to again help to provide market signals to importers and exporters of where resources should be used and how they should be properly priced.
Thanks very much indeed. I guess that speaks to the next question from Sebastian Fleischhacker, who takes the example of Brazil and asks, how can we convince Brazil to stop slowing down electrification because of their ethanol to sell it to airlines? Would you like to comment on that either?
I think so. Part of this is setting up the policies that would push the market to choose the alternative. So as I mentioned before, there isn't yet really a significant market in the aviation sector to buy these biofuel resources. If there were, by putting in place things like carbon pricing, putting in place blending mandates, as some regions are already doing, such as in Europe, that already starts to send the market signals, creates the demand for these bioenergy resources in another sector, one that arguably needs them more. I think that is one of the first things that really has to happen, which obviously is already a huge challenge of it in itself. And yeah, then I think it's a growing appreciation that climate change is a global problem. All countries need to work together with the limited amount of global resources, energy resources that we have, to try and decarbonize all sectors, all countries. As long as there is then a market, in the case of Brazil, if they're well compensated for the export of their bioenergies to other countries, I think that can be, can then work out better on that path.
Okay, thanks very much, Matteo. There's a quick poll for those on the Zoom, if you can let us know how we're doing, if you find this useful. We're just about at our time. I'll wrap up with one last question, which is basically about biodiversity. There's lots of comments about biodiversity linked to biofuel production. And does your work take account of biodiversity? Is that a measure of sustainability? How do you account for the effects of biofuel production in that aspect?
Yeah, thanks. So that's also a very, very good question. And so we've seen in the sustainably produced bioenergy that will be available in 2050. So this is based on a couple of parameters, which is available in scientific literature, and these are commonly agreed metrics. And so these values are based on academic literature. And so these things include no food or feed crops. That includes or takes into account indirect land use changes, which is commonly deforestation. So if bioenergy would be produced with deforestation, this would not be part of this sustainable bioenergy, if that was clear. And as well, as you said, preserving biodiversity. So yes, these things, they go into this definition of what is a sustainable biofuel or bioenergy.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We are right on time. Thank you very much, Matteo and Andreas, for a fantastic and unique report. Thanks for all our participants and for your questions. I'll just pop into the chat. Our very next Ask the Author session is on measuring the mobility. That's coming up next week. You can join us through that link in the chat, and ways to stay in touch with ITF through our social media platforms. Matteo, Andreas, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all our participants, and see you online soon.